Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting TIES webinar. My name is Kenny Coogan. I'm the Center for Inquiry's Education Coordinator, and we are in our second week of our webinar series for the school year 2025 to 2026. We're very excited to have Mark join us. Mark just published a book, Everything Evolves from Cells to Cell Phones. And if you're attending this live, and if you're a teacher, you have a very lucky chance of winning one of 3 copies of the book, which are donated by Princeton University Press, who have been wonderful partners for many, many years. And if you participate and ask questions, you have a better chance of winning a copy of the book. And with that, I will let Mark take it over. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. I appreciate Everything Evolves. The subtitle of the book is actually a bit longer. We'll see it in a minute. I use this shorter subtitle for the purposes of this talk. So the main theme in the book is the idea that evolutionary processes apply to a far wider range of phenomena than we tend to think. So we tend to think of it as being applicable to biology. We have some bacteria and some giraffes over here on the left. In fact, if you look carefully at how music, musical instruments, language, cuisine, technology changes over time, there's a set of processes that are unambiguously evolutionary. And so if we just begin with the example of bread, we can see what I'm talking about. So let's zoom in on what seems to us a very simple food that we eat almost every day, many of us. But in fact, it's a quite complicated process to make bread. And how did we actually get from thousands of years ago, humans would have been eating wild grass seed. And how did we get from wild grass seed up to loaves of bread? So it's possible to eat wild grass seed fresh, but perhaps by accident, perhaps just by experimenting, people discovered that grinding it first could help either digestibility or taste. They also discovered that if you soak it first, it helps with eating, again, digestibility or taste or other things. And after having these different options, perhaps they retain this option of grinding up into the future or soaking it, and maybe they do both. I'm not sure why there's an image missing there. And when we do both, we've got dough. And once we've got dough, we can either eat it uncooked or perhaps we can try cooking it. Cooking tastes a lot better, according to most of us. And so now we've got a new food item to eat. And once we have cooked bread, we can eat it unleavened. So, it hasn't risen. And it's almost certain that, the discovery of, making bread rise happened by accident when yeast, just naturally colonized somebody's dough. And then we can have leavened bread. And from there, we get all of these different modern kinds of breads that we see. And so if we were to summarize this process, what happened in general terms was that there were multiple options generated. Some of them worked better than others. The best options were kept for next time, and those steps were repeated over and over. So a very simple little recipe got us from wild grass seed up to loaves of bread. Now let's look at technology. I'm not going to trace the modern cell phone as far back as I did for bread, but let's say it's clear that telephones looked a whole lot different 100 years or so ago, and so we had multiple different types of phones. Some of them, were retained into the future. So here we have, a dial phone, and then one variant that arose was, a push button phone, and then maybe one with more functionality. And as we move forward, we're going to retain, maybe the one with more functionality. We're going to make it wireless so we can walk around the house. And then finally, we're going to end up with a phone that communicates via cell towers instead of direct lines. And from there, we have these flip phones, and now we have our modern smartphone, and we got from the past to the present via a very similar kind of process. So if we look at that process, we generated multiple options. Some worked better than others. The best options were kept for next time, and that was just repeated to get us, from telephones that were very, very different in the past to what we see today. we can look at an example from biology to see that, in fact, we have a very similar process happening at all of these levels. So now, one major problem in health sciences is antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So how did we get antibiotic-resistant bacteria? Our ancestors were almost certainly sensitive to antibiotics, but mutations create variation. So when these bacteria, give birth, if you will, to other bacteria, some of them will be a bit different. And just by chance, some of them might be, slightly resistant to antibiotics. And so when we apply antibiotics, those ones are favored. So in the next generation, those ones make it through. But there's still mutations happening, so new variants are produced. Some of them might even be more sensitive to to antibiotics, and other ones even more. And so we end up through this process of trial and error in biology, getting us to antibiotic-resistant bacteria. You won't be surprised by this point to see that the process is exactly the same. We generate multiple options. Some of them work better than others. We keep the best options for next time, and we repeat that process. And so this is a very simple example of biological evolution, but it can also get us from, single-celled organisms all the way up to humans and blue whales. The very same process, just with this set of steps repeated many more times. If we think about the biological case, I've been using these very, everyday words to describe the process. In biology, we have more specific terms to talk about this. When we learn biology in high school or at whatever level, these options are generated by mutation. And by that, I mean changes to DNA in the sequence of DNA. Those changes to the sequences of DNA can have consequences for the functioning of the organism. They can cause differences in the survival and reproduction of those organisms, which is what we call selection. And then inheritance just means that the DNA is passed on from parent to offspring. But when we look at this wider variety of cases, we don't have DNA, and so we don't have mutation specifically. And so we need a more general set of terms. And so here we can talk about variation, differential success, and inheritance. These are the three general categories of process that we need to define an evolutionary system. One more thing I want to add to this mix. So if we have variation, inheritance, and differential success, we have an evolutionary system. But out in the real world, there's one more thing that's ubiquitous that has a major impact on all real evolutionary systems, and that's movement. So if we imagine bacteria evolving, because they reproduce very rapidly, there's going to be millions, if not billions of them inside your body evolving in a single human body. If we have movement between two human bodies of resistant or sensitive to antibiotics bacteria, that's going to have a big impact on this overall evolutionary system. And at present, with people moving around the earth at unprecedented rates, bringing with them plants and animals, genes, ideas, cultures, what have you, movement at the moment has a huge impact on evolutionary systems. I want to now delve into the evolution of language, which is a particularly revealing case, because not only does language very clearly evolve, in a very analogous way, but the ideas in linguistics about evolution go back a very long way. So how did we get from the English spoken by Shakespeare up to the English in the songs of Missy Elliott, and how did we get such a diversity of languages? So one of the things that people who studied language figured out very early on is that the languages that people speak across the earth today have a common descent. That is, they emerged from a common ancestor. And this is one of the aspects of evolutionary theory when Darwin put the biological version forward in the 1850s, which was very controversial. The idea that humans, fish, bacteria, what have you, actually trace back their ancestry to a common place in the tree of life. They also found long ago that there were very consistent rules or changes that happened in languages, which suggests that there's a certain kind of selection happening in language as well. So here's a diagram I really like from 1853 showing for a set of languages how they trace their ancestry back to a common origin. And what's notable here is that 1853 is before the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species. So clearly linguists have really been thinking about change and diversity in evolutionary terms for a very long time, prompting some to say that long before Darwin, the idea of evolution had so completely dominated the science of language that to speak of Darwin as the discoverer of evolution has always seemed an insult to students of philosophy. So really, evolutionary ideas have been around for a very long time, applied well beyond the realm of biology. If we think, we can now look at language and just really, drill home this idea of these four processes and how they make up an evolutionary system. So the first ingredient I've mentioned is variation. And so in language, we can see it in its simplest form via synonyms for particular things. So ant, the animal, the little insect that we're all familiar with, there's a synonym for ant, which is pismire, a word that not too many people use anymore. Trucks can be called lorries in other places. Uh, and so we have variation. And then we also have differential success very clearly in language. So the word pismire is actually no longer in use. And so now we use the word ant. So some words succeed more than others, perhaps because they aid in communication. It's shorter, it doesn't bring up odd imagery, for example. And then we can also see it in that, one synonym will become dominant in a particular place, lorry in the United Kingdom, and a different word for the same object will become dominant somewhere else, like North America, in this case, Canada, for the case of the word truck. And in these two cases, we can actually see two ways that differential success can come about. One of them is what we call selection, so this non-random choice. So it's likely that ant was, preferred for a particular reason, whereas, lorry or truck, neither word seems like a better option, and it's just probably random chance that one of them ends up common in one place and another in another place. The next process is inheritance, and that just means that, if I happen to use the words ant and truck, it's probably because I inherited or learned that from my parents or teachers or friends, what have you. And somebody in the United Kingdom learned their vocabulary from a different set of people from which they inherited that vocabulary. Now, finally, movement is really evident in language because many of our words actually were imported from other languages. So the word pismire, in fact, was imported from Scandinavian languages into English before it ultimately went extinct and is out of use now. So those are the ingredients of not only how language evolves, but the ingredients of any evolutionary system. So this idea that I'm talking about, this generalized evolutionary theory, the idea that evolution applies to all of these things, has been called the second science. And it's a biologist named Graham Bell who gave it that term. And from his point of view, there's actually only two fundamental kinds of process that we need to understand everything in the universe. So one of them is physics and its downstream consequences, if you will. So chemistry, geology, and physiology, even cell biologists really mostly study the biochemistry of what happens inside cells. And so the explanation for all of the things that they study traces back to the laws of physics. But if you want to understand, where giraffes come from, how we ended up with different musical instruments, cuisine, technology, culture, what have you, you need a very different set of processes. This repeated sequence of generating variation, having differential success and selection is what we need to explain many other things, including all of what we study in evolutionary biology, economics, linguistics, and many other disciplines. And the key here is that these phenomena cannot be understood in terms nor reduced to the principles of physics and chemistry. So we're really talking about a fundamentally different branch of science that Graham Bell calls the second science, and without saying it explicitly, it implies that physics is the first science. Okay, so I'm certainly not the first person to put forward the idea that there's this generalized evolutionary theory that applies far beyond biology. And when people have gone about making that argument, the typical approach to doing it is as follows. So they start with evolutionary biology as if that's the place evolution was first discovered and first worked out, which is itself a questionable assumption. Then they export it elsewhere into the social sciences, economics, archaeology, history, culture, what have you. And there's a couple problems with this. One is we end up with analogies. We force analogies that can ultimately fail. And some would say that when an analogy fails, the whole project fails, but really the analogies are unnecessary. I'll show you an example of that in a moment. A second problem is that there's really an obsession with Darwin and the neo-Darwinian view or version of evolutionary theory that we have at the moment, a synonym of which is the modern synthesis. And we can see a famous book by that title up here in the top right of the slide. And in that neo-Darwinian version of modern evolutionary theory, we have genes, we have DNA, things that just don't exist in any of these other realms. And so always bringing our focus back to neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory can also cause a problem. So let's take a closer look at these two issues. So in terms of analogies, we have organisms in biology, and inside those organisms is DNA and genes, which provide the instructions for, building your mouse. And so, a lot of effort has been put into finding analogies in culture. And so one, that, the brain is, let's say, the vessel in which gene-like things are held and then, passed along to others. And the meme, in this case, let's say the meme of God is a very small unit of culture that gets passed on just like a gene. You can probably see already that this is a pretty weak analogy. And even the word meme, which, was used, quite frequently in science, now is mostly just used to refer to funny little bits of internet humor that get spread around a lot. And that's probably a better use for the word meme. So the analogies often fall apart, but the fact that the analogies fall apart really don't matter for the larger project, because we don't need, for example, analogies for verb tenses in a genome any more than we need an analogy for a gene when we talk about culture. So when we look at something like the evolution of technology, it's clear that we have variation, inheritance, and differential success happening over time, which makes this an evolutionary system. Whether or not we have clear analogies for genes, genomes, or phenotypes, phenotypes maybe. A phenotype is a measurable characteristic of an organism, but really, it's very highly unclear whether or not these analogies are going to work. In most cases, they ultimately don't work very well. But as I said, it does not matter for the overall project of thinking and building about and building general evolutionary theory. So one of the issues with focusing too closely on Darwin and Darwinism is that after the publication of The Origin of Species, there were many people who essentially misapplied Darwin's ideas to promote racist, classist, points of view, eugenics, this idea that evolution leads to progress. For example, humans are somehow, more advanced than other types of organisms, whereas really evolutionary theory supports none of these ideas. Bacteria are equally exquisitely adapted to their current circumstances, as are human beings. And so this is a very sort of dark and unfortunate chapter in the history of people thinking about evolution, but really evolutionary theory supports none of it, and it need not distract us from this idea that, in fact, evolution does apply well beyond the realm of biology. A perhaps more surprising aspect of this idea that I put forward about a focus on Darwin being potentially distracting is that some of the assumptions of neo-Darwinism are not necessary for a more general evolutionary process. So one of the assumptions of neo-Darwinism, for example, is that variation is created blindly. That is, when a mutation happens in DNA in the genome of an organism, there's no way for that organism to sort of make that mutation happen in a way that helps that organism. It happens at random. It might be beneficial. It probably isn't, but it's really truly at random. And the other is that inheritance, so DNA is always getting passed from parent to offspring rather than between contemporaries. And we can see for technology that clearly this isn't true. So when we go from this, dial phone up to a modern cell phone, we have elements or components that are added, not from other telephones, but from completely different technologies. And they were not added at random either. So microprocessors, cameras, are now inside cell phones, not because they ended up there at random, but because people put them for a reason. And they were inherited from completely different kinds of technology, not from other types of phones. So clearly, these assumptions are not applicable to human culture. But what's really interesting is that they're not strictly applicable to all aspects of biology either. They are not hard rules in biological evolution. So as one example, there are clearly human intentions involved in the selective process that got us from wild dogs to domestic dogs. But the presence of those human intentions does not somehow make the process non-evolutionary. We also have other modes of inheritance, and it need not be from parents. So here's a chimpanzee using a tool to catch insects out of a tree trunk, and it may have learned or inherited that trait in a way that's very different than DNA, for example, and it might have been from a contemporary. Now, finally, microbes like bacteria, it turns out they do all kinds of things that deviate from these more strict rules of neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory. As just one example, details of which I won't go into, but I'd be happy to talk about it later. Uh, there's something called CRISPR, which is a technology. It's best known now as a biotechnology for modifying DNA, but inside bacteria, it actually involves uh, taking a piece of viral DNA when a virus infects a bacterial cell, incorporating it into the bacterial genome so that when that virus comes back later, there's now a record of it in the bacterial cell to then attack that incoming virus. So in short, there's a mutation in the bacteria in the genome of bacteria that was prompted by this viral attack, which is also favorable to that cell in the face of viral attack. So it's clearly not random, and nor was it inherited from what you would call another bacterial parent. And so really there's just huge overlap in many different aspects of cultural and biological evolution, even if there are some tendencies in which processes are more or less important. Okay, so if we return to this overall approach that people have used of, starting with neo-Darwinian evolutionary biology involving genes, DNA, and so on, and exporting it to many other disciplines, this is what I think we don't want to do if we want to build a more general evolutionary set of ideas, and we need to break free of what I call in the book the Darwinian distraction. What we need to do instead is think about all of these different disciplines on the same level. So evolution happens in economics, in culture, in ecosystems, in politics, to the same degree that it happens in the evolution of individual species in the ways that we're more familiar. And once we put them all on an even playing field, I think we can more easily appreciate just how broadly applicable is the second science or generalized evolutionary theory. This is what I wrote my book about. And here we can see the longer subtitle, Why Evolution Explains More Than We Think from Proteins to Politics. So in the book, you can learn about artificial intelligence, technology, tipping points, language, globalization and diversity, and many other things, and how evolution applies to all of them in ways that are sometimes surprisingly similar from case to case. Just to give you a small taste of the contents of the book beyond just a set of topics, what I offer as a tool, if you will, to think about all the different evolutionary processes is what I call an evolutionary soundboard. So when scientists characterize the evolutionary process, often we'll build a mathematical model, but the essence of what's happening there is that we have a bunch of inputs that influence how evolution works. And so, for example, we'll have a couple of dials on this soundboard for just how fast variation is produced. I'm not going to have the time to go into the details of each of them, but if we take this one on the top left, we can dial up how fast variation is generated. It can be generated quickly, it can be generated slowly, and then we need to know, how the characteristics of the new variants differ from the old one. That's the distribution of trait effects here. When we talk about inheritance, we might like to know, is that inheritance mostly coming vertically, that is from parents to offspring, or can it also be horizontal? A lot of genes actually get transferred between cells in a type of inheritance that we would call horizontal. I won't go into the rest of it, but the idea here is that we can think of all of these different types of evolutionary systems as being subject to the very same set of processes, and we can think of those processes as dials that just sort of get turned up and down in order to characterize that particular case of evolution. So in one example we can think about during the Anthropocene, which is this period of time during which humans have dominated, many of the dynamics, both biological and physical on the Earth. Essentially, one of the big things that happened is that we've cranked up the movement dial. That is, there are now far more people, ideas, genes, and so on being moved around the Earth than there were, let's say, 500 years ago. And so what are the consequences of that? So one of the consequences is actually that locally you can get very high diversity in evolutionary systems. So if we have people moving across the Earth, in New York City, illustrated here, there are now 700 languages spoken in New York City. So huge diversity because of all this movement of people. And that compares to, roughly 300 native languages in all of North America, north of Mexico. and it's roughly 10% of the entire global total, so huge local diversity. And this can also apply in biology. So if we look at the city of Montreal, for which I had some data on how many kinds of trees are there, very different kind of evolutionary system. The language, we have more than 200 species of trees growing in Montreal, and that's greater than the entire number of native species across Canada. And again, it's because of the movement of many, many different species into North America from other parts of the world. So the last little short section here, I want to talk about something at least indirectly related to teaching, which is I know is the focus of your organization. So if we think about how scientific institutions are structured, it's actually very similar to the way that we structure, the teaching of the natural and the social sciences. So when we say natural science, at the level of high school, we often just mean science, and social sciences we might call social studies. But these are very fundamental divisions. So universities have faculties of natural sciences and social sciences. Funding agencies give out research funds under these two large umbrellas. And so what I'm proposing is that there's a very different way that we can actually think of, a deep distinction among different branches of science. And so we have physical sciences and evolutionary sciences. These are the first and second science that I talked about. Now, there's no such thing as a social system that is purely physical. So there's only three of the boxes filled here. But I think that this second science, deserves recognition as a very fundamental pillar of the whole scientific enterprise that cuts across the natural social science divide. And so one can imagine one day, maybe somebody, instead of building faculties of natural sciences and social sciences, they'll build faculties of evolutionary sciences and physical sciences instead. If we think about teaching evolution, which I suspect that you know more about than I do, at least at the level of, high school or before, as an evolutionary biologist, it is clearly key to understanding how life works. But I think one of the messages in the book is also that it's key in the sense that it's the process that also produces change in economies, cultures, technologies, and societies. And so it's really a fundamental way that things change over time that I think is important for people to know if they want to understand all of these different things. With that, I thank you for your attention. And here are some institutions, funding agencies, and one particular collaborator to thank. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark, for an excellent presentation. My name is Kenny Coogan. I'm the CFI Education Coordinator. And for CFI, we have three programs. TIES, the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science, is just one of them. For TIES, we do a monthly or bi-monthly webinar series during the school year. We have some really great webinars coming up. The bottom left is Jerry De Silva, and he is by far the most popular webinar that we've had, and he was on 2 years ago. And right now we have over 25,000 views from his last webinar. He's a professor of anthropology at Dartmouth College, so we're excited to have him come again. And then the bottom right, we have Brianna Pobnar, and she joined the Smithsonian in 2005, and she helped put together the Hall of Human Origins at the National Museum of Natural History. To learn more about TIES, you can go to tieseducation.org. We're very active on our Facebook page. The handle is RDFRS TIES, which I'm going to bring back to Mark at the end of this. And then we're very active on YouTube. We post all of our webinars there, so you can see a few years of webinars. We've also organized playlists for middle school and high school teachers to play different snippets into their classroom. We have full curriculum for middle school and high school evolution units available in English and Spanish. If you go to our website, tieseducation.org, you will see that we have full units. We also have labs, hands-on activities, bell ringers, video clips, sorted by standard, also by topic, like natural selection, human evolution, food webs, food chains, and all of our resources are free. The only thing that we have to offer for sale is our book, and that is because we have to pay the publisher to print copies of the book. But we are having a buy one, get one sale right now. So if you buy one, you can gift it to your science department or your favorite science teacher. This book was written by, I think, 14 members of the TIES Core, and all of these teachers have tackled the topic of evolution in their classroom for decades, and it offers practical advice. And if you don't want to buy the book, you can go to our website and get all of those resources for free. And the foreword was written by Richard Dawkins. Another program that we have is Science Saves. Science touches all of us, from vaccines that save to discoveries that shape our world. You can join Science Saves in celebrating National Science Appreciation Day by going to our website, and then you can click on the petition to get your governor to participate in National Science Appreciation Day. We also, for the past 5 years or so, have been giving away $10,000 for first prize and $5,000 for second prize for high school seniors who create a 30-second video about what science has done for them, how science has improved their lives. Science Saves also share stories about people around the world and how science has improved their life. But let me back up. You can see if your state is participating in National Science Appreciation Day. And if not, you should get your governor to participate. But what I was going to say is that we also have free resources, K through 12, elementary through high school. All of our lessons have teacher lesson plans. So in case you need to submit it to your principal or your school board, we have you covered. And we have everything is editable. So we have PowerPoints and Word, and you can make it your own because you know your students the best. And the last program I want to tell you about is Generation Skeptics. This program aims to develop and foster an understanding of the world through inquiry-based learning. And that's because right now in 2025, students, young people are getting an onslaught of information. It's like a fire hose of information. And how will they be able to decipher between misconceptions and facts and truths? So we have all your free lessons for that as well. Like I mentioned earlier, Princeton University Press has been a proud partner of our TIES webinars for many years. And this book is brand new by Mark. If you go down here and you type in that coupon code, you get 30% off this wonderful book. And if you attended this live, you have a very good chance of winning a copy of this book. And the winners for tonight's event are going to be Will T, Paul N, and Jen V. And if you guys could send me your mailing addresses, I will relay that information to Princeton University Press, and they will send you a copy of Mark's book. All right. Thank you, Mark, for that brief commercial. Will just sent a little, oh, and Jen Valvo also sent a little heart. And, oh, okay, very good. Okay. So in the beginning, or not in the beginning, but in their presentation, you were talking about memes. And I just have to say the word meme was coined by a British evolutionary biologist, Richard Dawkins, in the 1976 book, The Selfish Gene. And Richard Dawkins' foundation helped start TIES, the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science, about just over 10 years ago. And I did not mention this, but we've presented in all 50 states over 350 workshops, in-person workshops to teachers. Okay, Paul asks or says, in biological evolution, DNA stores and transmits information across generations. In cultural evolution, information spreads through symbols, language, and digital platforms. How might comparing these two models of inheritance help students grasp the university of information in evolving systems?
Yeah, so I think it's important for people to understand all the different ways that inheritance can happen. Information can be transmitted across generations or from one person to another. And even in biology, uh, the last 20 or 30 years has seen a huge interest in different pathways of inheritance. So there's genetic inheritance, and then one of great interest is epigenetic inheritance. So little tags on particular DNA base pairs can alter the function of a gene, and they don't alter the sequence, but they can also be inherited. Maybe not as stably over a long period of time. There's cultural inheritance, which as you mentioned, comes in the form of symbols. But what I think can be appreciated by everybody is that when you back up and forget about the nitty-gritty details, at its core there's still a very similar set of processes happening. So what counts as a variant, in biology it would be a DNA sequence with a change that just happened, and in technology it might be a new model of a cell phone, but might even be one that happened in a lab, like they literally just changed one little component, and evolution is happening in that lab as well. But again, if you just think about it in the most general terms, it's the exact same sequence of things that are happening. Variants get generated, they get passed from one time to the next, and there's differential success of those different variants. But I think that contrasting them to people and talking about all the different ways that inheritance can happen, focusing on their commonalities is what I would want to do personally if I'm trying to communicate the idea that there really is one unified process happening here.
Okay, I'll read you Mark's follow up, or no, I'll read you Paul's follow up. He says memes can spark cultural tipping points, example, viral moments or political shifts, just as genetic mutations can trigger evolutionary transitions. How can educators use viral meme culture to illustrate the unpredictability and emergent properties of evolving systems? And I'll add that Paul was a middle school and high school science teacher, and now he's teaching people who want to be science educators in college.
Mm, hmm. Yeah, so I mean, the idea of there's a chapter in the book about critical transitions or tipping points, which is one topic, and uh, sometimes they get triggered by something very specific and simple, but it's almost always because a system has been pushed in a certain direction, and all you needed was one more little push to cause a huge change, which is difficult to reverse, which is why these tipping points are um, uh, of such great interest, because it's a huge change that's difficult to reverse. And so economic meltdowns are a good example, and then there's ecosystems that can rapidly transition, for example, from domination by corals in a coral reef to domination by algae. But it's not, even though you can potentially trace it back to a particular event, a disease event in sea urchins, for example, which was the last thing that pushed it. It's rarely that single event that is key. It was sort of pushed, for example, fishing pressure is one of the things that can push a coral reef in a certain direction, such that after a certain point, there'll be a huge change. And the same thing happens in cultural systems. Memes, in the form of, little videos can have a big impact. I'm not sure how often they actually trigger, sort of stable, lasting change, although certainly, they can make some contribution there.
All right, very good. So Jen asks or says, you mentioned CRISPR. This may be a little specific, but do you know how the bacteria knows that piece of the virus it should keep a copy of to recognize it in the future?
Well, so yeah, I wouldn't necessarily use the verb knows. So I assume we're talking in kind of you know metaphorical terms. Um, but uh, you know, I suppose you can ask, how does an organism know anything? So how does a plant, quote, know milkweed plant that when it gets poked, it should release and produce a whole bunch of latex to 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 defend itself against that insect. These are evolved responses, if you will. They came about via the exact same evolutionary process that I just described, and sometimes it really is a head scratcher how sophisticated they become. It sure seems like that bacteria knows what it's doing, but again, these are variants that arose, uh, and its strategy of using CRISPR probably did arise via random mutation, but CRISPR itself involves now non-random mutations. And so, I'm not a cell biologist, so I can't actually describe exactly, which portion of the viral genome it tends to grab, or and why. Uh, but yeah, I hope that's an answer that at least helps a little bit without getting into all the details. Anyway, I forgot to thank Paul for the questions. Thank you very much, and thanks Jennifer as well for the
Now,
questions.
Jennifer
These are
did
good
write,
questions.
apologies if this question isn't within your wheelhouse, but I purposefully did not read that to you, Mark. But I
Oh, it's
think you
okay. Well, I
answered
mean,
it
I do. I
eloquently.
mean, I have read enough to have a sense of how CRISPR works, but I can't delve deeply into the molecular details.
Okay, I think we have three more comments. What are your thoughts on how the internet and readily available misinformation is influencing evolution with our societies? How do you think selection in this context will come into play?
I mean, that's a huge question, and so what the internet does, among other things, is accelerate massively the movement of information. So the number of people that can see a video, hear the news, uh, instantaneously almost, is so much greater than it used to be. And so if we think about that, um, evolutionary soundboard, if you will, and you simply accelerate the process of inheritance, not only does it happen faster, but in fact we can inherit or get ideas from so many more people. uh, I would say that one of the consequences of all of that is accelerating potential evolutionary change, because as long as inheritance only ever happens from a few people, it'll sort of slow down the system-wide potential for change. But when everybody hears everything immediately at the level of culture and what people think, things can change extremely rapidly. Specifically, how it changes particular aspects of culture, I don't dare to, you know, make a guess on, but I would say that it speeds things up for sure.
What advice do you have for high school students who are interested in studying your line of work, cultural evolution, science, or biological evolution?
What would I suggest they do read?
Yeah, what suggestion do you have for them to like get into that degree or line of work, or like how do they know that's actually really for them before they spend tens of thousands of dollars in college?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we test things out. So many college degrees. I mean, if you're interested in science, there's a great diversity of careers one can pursue with a degree in science, and many of them begin with, you know, freshman years where you get overviews, and towards the end of high school you can delve deeply into different subjects. But whoever your teacher is, if you're interested in learning about more about evolution, they'll have recommendations. Um, I'm not sure my book is necessarily targeted people early in high school, but in fact, uh, I was given the advice early on when I was writing to try to think of a particular person that you're writing to, and when you're trying to get the level of material right, think of that person. And I struggled for a long time to think of who that might be. But my daughter, in where I live in Quebec, things work a little bit differently. But effectively, she was something like a senior in high school, in the American educational system when I was writing, and I realized she's the person, someone who's just curious about how things work, has some background in science, having been through several years of high school, um, and wants to know more. So I'd say if you're towards the end of high school, make sure your library has a copy of my book and get it out. But there's lots to read out there, accounts of evolution and evolutionary ideas at many different levels. I don't have them right at the tip of my tongue to give you specific suggestions, but there's no shortage of things to read. But hopefully you'll have good teachers to give you some guidance locally, and I'm sure you
Very
do.
good. Okay, that was excellent. I'm glad we mentioned that question. Paul says, can't wait to read your book, Mark. I'm definitely going to reference your book in my classes moving forward.
Awesome. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everyone who attended this live, and thank you so much, Mark. And Paul
Nice.
says, I wish you
I can
had
see
you
I saw the comment
when I
pop
was a
up.
younger kid. All right. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much.